Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review and part 2 of Schiit Week. So yes, if your week wasn't already shitty enough after the Modius review, I'm back again with the Bifrost 2 review as promised. And if you haven't yet seen the Modius review, I'll put a link down below so you can jump over and have a look at that one as well. Because both of these are fantastic DACs from Schiit. Both of them are fully balanced, but they use a slightly different approach. The Modius was outstanding and really impressed me. So the biggest question for me coming into this was, does the multi-bit approach used in the Bifrost 2 produce even better sound quality than the chip-based design of the Modius? The Bifrost 2 is a $699 US DAC, and that places it at just under 1,000 Australian dollars, not including any shipping costs. So it's not an overly expensive DAC, but it's also not a cheap DAC. It sits in line with other products on the market like the Topping D90 and the Denafrips Ares II that I've in both cases recently reviewed on the channel. And so for this review, I will be comparing the Bifrost 2 to both of those because I see them as three direct competitors. As always, before we get into the sound quality and the comparisons, let's take a look at the features, functions and design of the Bifrost 2 here. As with all of Schiit's DACs, the front panel is very basic. We've got the normal selector switch here, and then we've got a series of indicator lights to show you which input you're using. But in the case of the Bifrost 2, there are also two different things. One of them is a larger open hole, which is the eye for the infrared remote control. I'll talk about the remote shortly. The other thing on the front is an additional LED light to show you if the phase has been switched or not. The Bifrost 2 is one of the first DACs I've come across where you've got the ability to switch the phase of the signal coming out. The theory behind that is that some recordings are actually produced out of phase. For example, if a guitar string is plucked, there will be a sound wave that comes off that guitar string. Now let's say that the sound wave, the leading edge of that sound wave is high pressure. That's then going to be followed by a low pressure and then a high pressure, then a low pressure, then a high pressure, etc. In some cases, recordings are produced in a way that flips that, and so instead of it being a high pressure wave in this example that hits you first, instead you're hearing a low pressure wave followed by a high pressure wave. What that may mean is that it could change our perception of the sound. I haven't spent a lot of time playing with this. I've read up on it a little bit, and some people say it's inaudible. Others say that being out of phase can produce a slightly thin and hollow sound to the music. It's something I need to investigate further. But the key thing here is if you are sensitive to things being out of phase and you want the option, the Bifrost 2 can let you do that. Importantly, it will let you switch it from the remote control so you don't need to be constantly interacting with the DAC, and in fact there is no way to switch the phase except with that remote control. The only problem of course with this is there's no way to know automatically if a recording is in phase or out of phase. So what that means is you would need to know album by album which of your recordings you need to switch this on or off for. So that's going to require a lot of attention to detail. It's not something I can see myself ever using, but some people will be glad that it's there, and if you don't need to use it, it doesn't really matter, you just switch it off and leave it off. Having covered the front of the Bifrost 2, let's now take a look at the back. So around here on the back of the device, we've got, again, all of the normal inputs and outputs you'd expect for a DAC. You've got the XLRs on the side here for the balanced output. You've also got RCAs for single-ended output. One thing to note about the XLRs is they're technically kind of upside down. I shouldn't say technically. They are, compared to what we're used to, they're upside down. Because normally we'd see the 3 pins at the bottom of the circular socket. In the case of the Bifrost 2, they're actually sitting at the top of the socket. Now, I think that's purely because when you look at the photos on Schiit's website of the Bifrost 2's internals, the circuit boards for the USB and the analog output are sort of upside down. They're mounted above the other circuit boards and facing with the componentry facing inwards. So it's purely just a matter of how they've been mounted. It doesn't matter, it doesn't change anything, but it does mean if you're disconnecting another DAC and plugging in the Bifrost 2, you'll probably have to twist your XLR cables 180 degrees. Not a big deal. Moving on from the analog outputs, we've got the USB card that I mentioned with the USB-B socket here, and as I said before, it's also kind of upside down, but again with USB-B sockets, that's not uncommon to have them in both directions. We've then got optical and coaxial as well. So there's no AES, no I2S, anything like that on the Bifrost 2, but it does have all of your regular standard connections in coaxial, optical, and USB. Finally, across to your right-hand side here, we've got the power switch and the full-size power socket. So I want to mention the power switch. In a lot of cases I've raised before that I don't like having power switches on the back of devices. The Bifrost 2 and actually any of the Multibit devices from Schiit, it's worth having them switched on all the time. From what I've read in the past, you do get slight improvements in performance when the product is warm, and that comes down to the tolerance of the circuits in the Multibit chip being more accurate at a consistent operating temperature. In my experiences living with the Schiit Gunyear Multibit for many years, I didn't notice huge changes between when it was cold and when it was warm, but I do believe that there will be very minor benefits to be had, and so it is a product that I would tend to leave on pretty much all the time. However, if you want to switch it off, you can switch it off here with the switch at the back. Before I continue on, I just want to talk briefly about the remote control. I've talked a few times about remote controls recently, starting off with the TT2 and the M-Scaler over here, that despite costing as much as a small car, doesn't have a very good set of remotes. They're very plasticky. So to open a $700 US DAC and find a solid aluminium remote in there was really impressive and goes to show what should be being done by companies like Cord. This remote control doesn't do a great deal, but the fact that it feels and looks so good is a really nice touch. As for its functions, it'll let you mute the outputs, change the inputs, and flip the phase, as I talked about before. So as I said, it's not particularly well functioned, but it does all you need it to do, given that the DAC is not a preamp, it doesn't have a whole lot of different filters, it's just a very focused, dedicated DAC. What's nice about this is it means if you're sitting back in an armchair or on a sofa, you can change the inputs, flip the phase, do what you need to do without having to get up and go to the DAC. And indeed, most of the functions on here can't be done from the DAC itself, only changing inputs. So I just wanted to mention that. I think it's a nice inclusion, but now let's get back to talking about the DAC. There are two other things that I want to mention. One of them is that it uses Schiit's own Unison USB. And what that means is that for all current and fairly recent versions of Windows, for Linux and for Mac, it is completely plug and play. There are no drivers required for Windows. You literally just connect it up and you've got the best possible sound quality straight away. The other thing I wanted to mention was responding to a question from a viewer on the channel, and as I mentioned in the Modius review, I can't remember which DAC it was referring to, but I want to confirm that in the case of the Bifrost 2, there's no latency that I could perceive from my day-to-day use. For those of you not familiar with latency, that means the time it takes for whatever you're doing in your source device, in this case a computer, to then reach the DAC, be decoded in the DAC, and sent out to your amplifier and therefore your speakers or your headphones. In the case of the Bifrost 2, I'm able to do all my video editing and the audio splicing that I do there with no problems of lag or timing issues. In the case of something like the TT2 and the M-Scaler over here, there are significant lags produced by the processing being done by the M-Scaler. That can make fine detail scrubbing through a timeline of audio very challenging when you're looking for the beginning or the end of a certain sound. In the case of the Bifrost 2, I have no such trouble, and it's actually taken on the duties of being my go-to amplifier for regular PC sound. The TT2 and the M-Scaler is absolutely still my dedicated music system, but the Bifrost 2 does pretty much everything else. So hopefully at this point what you're seeing is we've got a nice sleek design DAC that's really compact, really clean. It's got all the features you need, a couple of extras in terms of things like the phase switching, but other than that it is just a well-featured and clean and smart looking fully balanced DAC. The other thing I need to mention before we talk about sound quality is, and I've alluded to this already, is that the Bifrost 2 uses Schiit's Multibit technology. Now, for those of you not familiar, Multibit is essentially the same as R2R, meaning that it's using a series of resistors, in this case built into a fairly complex chip. It's using a series of resistors to decode the sound instead of a Delta Sigma approach like an AKM or a Sabre or a Cirrus Logic DAC chip. What that means is that in theory, the Bifrost 2 should bring all of the same benefits that people attribute to R2R and Multibit designs, namely better soundstage size and better sense of spatial information. In the case of the Bifrost 2 and all of Schiit's Multibit DACs, what they're using is actually a medical grade chip that was never designed for audio. So there's a little bit of engineering wizardry going on from the team at Schiit to make this chip, or actually chips I believe, do the decoding for audio instead of working in their intended medical purpose. That may sound like a bad idea to try and repurpose something to do something it was never intended to do, but obviously the proof is in the pudding, and that's why we need to listen to a product like this to really know. One final thing before I tell you if it has or hasn't worked is that Schiit's multibit DACs don't do high sample rates. So there's no DSD, there's no 300 plus kilohertz sample rates here, it's just up to 192 kilohertz only. So given that we've got limitations or potential limitations in terms of no high-res sample rates and also this medical grade chip being repurposed to do something it was never intended to do, let's talk a bit about the sound. Describe the sound from the Bifrost 2 as both beautiful and natural. It's a really enjoyable DAC, and it struck me immediately as I listened to it just how lifelike the sound from the Bifrost 2 is. It provides lots of great detail, but it doesn't get glary, there's no digital edge to the sound, it's just really natural, but also very detailed. To me, it sits somewhere between a really hyper-focused chip-based DAC like maybe something like the RME ADI2 and the Denafrips Ares II R2R DAC. So the Denafrips Ares II gets a bit too smooth and too rich for my tastes, but it does have this expansive soundstage. On the flip side, the ADI2 doesn't have the expansive soundstage, but is incredibly revealing and focused on detail. The Bifrost 2 sits between both of those. It is probably closer to the ADI2's level of detail, but it still retains great spatial information and a very natural sound similar to the Ares 2, but maybe not quite as pronounced. As always with DACs, I think the best way to put them into context is with some direct comparisons. And so I started off, while I still had the Ares 2 here, I started off with a comparison of that. What I found is that the Bifrost 2 definitely does not have the sense of space that the Ares 2 does. But on the flip side to that, it produces a much better sense of resolution and detail. As I listened to a range of tracks across both DACs, what I found was that on just a few tracks, I definitely preferred the Ares 2. So something like My Reverie by Ella Fitzgerald and The Planet Suite by Holst, I tended to lean more towards the Ares 2. And that's because of the sense of space that it produces and the very rich and smooth sound it produces. That said, I prefer the Bifrost 2 on more tracks than I did the Ares 2. On a track like Lose Yourself to Dance by Daft Punk, I found that the Bifrost 2 better rendered the cymbals. They were more natural and had a better sense of harmonic richness where it should, whereas I found that the smoothness of the Ares 2 made some things sound a little bit artificial. It kind of overdid it a little bit. So for me, out of the two DACs, I would personally choose the Bifrost 2, but I can imagine there'll still be plenty of people out there that prefer the additional smoothness of the Ares. Just know that with the Ares, you are giving up a little bit of resolution in order to get that extra soundstage space, and it can occasionally sound a little unnatural. The Bifrost 2, you're getting a more natural sound, but you are sacrificing a degree of space. Not as much as you're sacrificing with a lot of the chip-based DACs out there, but a little bit compared to the Ares. Speaking of chip-based DACs, let's talk now about the Bifrost 2 up against the Topping D90. One thing I didn't expect when I put these two against each other was that the Bifrost 2 actually gave me a better sense of detail and textual information from the music. I expected the D90 with its very, very, very clean measurements and its chip-based design bringing everything forward in the mix. What I was expecting was that the Bifrost 2 would probably sound a bit smoothed off and rounded next to the D90. But listening to Hold On by Sarah McLachlan, I found I was hearing more texture and more detail from the Bifrost 2. Moving over to Pan Man by Tommy Emmanuel, which is a live recording, there was no doubt that the Bifrost 2 was creating the better sense of reverb and ambient space of the venue where the recording was made. Ultimately, everything coming out of the Bifrost 2 just came across more realistic and more detailed sounding. The differences weren't huge, so I should put this all into context that the differences were minimal. The D90 is still an outstanding DAC, but again, I found the Bifrost 2 just edged ahead for me because of its ability to produce the space and the realism in the sound. One interesting track that I listened to in terms of what it showed from the two DACs was Mama Talking by Parov Stellar. On my first listen, I thought the D90 was bringing forward more detail because everything is quite flat. It's more of a wall of sound in front of you rather than the three-dimensionality of the Bifrost 2. At first listen, I thought I was hearing more detail from the D90, but as time went on, what I found was that it was actually getting quite fatiguing because it was a bit too forceful with everything. And the D90 is quite a smooth DAC for a chip-based DAC, but it was still just a bit more forceful than I'd like on a track that's all samples and quite electronic, like Mama Talking. There will still be people that prefer the sound of the D90, that prefer that additional sense of energy and detail, and a lot of that's going to come down to the system that you're pairing these DACs with. So across the board here, whether you're talking Ares II, D90, or the Bifrost 2, they're all fantastic and they kind of sit within a continuum where at one end I'd put the D90 as highly detailed, a little bit in your face and energetic, but done very, very well. At the other end, you've got the Ares II being very spacious, very smooth and a bit rolled off. And then somewhere in the middle, but probably more towards the D90, you've got the Bifrost 2. So if you've got, let's call it 1 is the Ares and 100 is the D90. I'm just using arbitrary figures, they don't mean anything. But if we've got 1 and we've got 90, I think for me, I'd put the Bifrost 2 somewhere about 65 to 70, meaning that it errs more towards the detail and resolution of the D90, sometimes providing better detail and resolution, but still with a healthy dose of spatial information similar to the Ares II. Some of you may be wondering, because I'm clearly saying good things about the Bifrost 2, you may be wondering how it stacks up against my favourite system, the TT2 and the M-Scaler. And what I can tell you is I put them side by side, I did some blind A/B testing, and they were incredibly close in terms of their tonal qualities. So the Bifrost 2 does things that I haven't heard other DACs do in terms of getting the transient and timing information right. And that's where it's able to get away from having the digital glare and the digital edge that DACs that don't get timing information right, in other words, most chip-based DACs, it does that really, really well. And so it creates this beautiful smooth tonality without losing any detail or resolution. That's not to say it's an equivalent to the TT2 with or without the M-Scaler, but it's heading in the right direction. And I think tonally, it's a really fantastic DAC. In fact, I wish that I still had the Chord Cutest here because I think the Bifrost 2 would give the Cutest a real run for its money. And those of you that have watched this channel for a while know how much I love the Cutest. I have a feeling that the addition of balanced outputs on the Bifrost 2 and its significantly lower price, it's getting in the range of half the price of the Cutest, I think that would put the Bifrost 2 over the edge as my recommendation instead of the Cutest. But that is all from memory, so don't hold me to that. It's something that I'm just playing with and I wish I had the Cutest here to actually compare it. What you can take away from this as a certainty though, is the Bifrost 2 is an absolute killer DAC. It does everything right, it does absolutely nothing wrong. And if you're in the market for a DAC, I would highly recommend the Bifrost 2 to pretty much anybody. The only people that wouldn't want to buy a Bifrost 2 are those that have DSD collections or are particularly interested in highly upscaled or high sample rate recordings and need something that goes above 192 kilohertz. For everybody else on the planet, I think the Bifrost 2 is an absolute winner and I highly recommend it. So if that sounds interesting to you, I'll put a link down below where you can jump through to the Schiit website, read up more about the Bifrost 2 and buy one for yourself. As always, unless I declare otherwise, I'm not getting any kickbacks from this. This is just a product that I believe more and more people should buy because it is fantastic. If you found this review useful, please think about liking and subscribing. It really helps grow the channel and that raises our profile and gets more products sent to me for reviews that I can share with you. Speaking of more products, another great reason to subscribe is I've got some great content coming up. I've got the Hi-Fi Sundaras, the HD800S, the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus, the Blonde BL03, the KBE KS2. As you can see, lots and lots of gear coming down the pipeline, and there's stuff I haven't even mentioned there because I can't remember, but I've got a pile of it here in my office. So do think about subscribing. Stay tuned for those future reviews. But in the meantime, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.